In the early morning of May 20th, 1967, industrial mechanic and amateur geologist Stefan Michalak, known to go by Steve, was prospecting for quartz and precious metals in the Falcon Lake area of the White Shell Provincial Park, just west of the Manitoba-Ontario border and about 80 kilometers or 50 miles north of the border between Canada and the United States. While picking at a quartz vein, he noticed a strange glow in the sky. He saw two oval-shaped objects glowing an intense red or scarlet color. Keeping the same parallel distance between them, as if they were actually attached, these two objects dropped from the sky. Suddenly, one of the oval objects stopped and hovered, while the other object kept sailing towards the ground, eventually landing close by where Steve was working. As silently as they came, the hovering object ascended and disappeared in the sky. Still kneeling with his rock hammer in hand, Steve peered through his safety goggles as this object shifted colors from a dark red to a silver shine. He noticed a diamond-shaped opening in the side of the craft that he estimated was about 2 feet wide and 3 feet high. The air was heavy with a sulfurous odor as the craft wafted waves of warm air in his direction. There was a faint sound of what Steve described as an electric motor whirring and occasional hisses of air in an otherwise silent, forested area. Steve scanned the seamless skin of the craft, looking for any sort of identifying insignia, but he found none. He described the craft as being cigarette-shaped things with humps in the middle, 10.5 meters or 34 feet in length, and 4.5 meters, 15 feet in height. He went on to say that the skin of the craft changed in color, resembling hot stainless steel, comparing it to colored glass. Due to the Cold War and the looming threat from the USSR, Steve thought that the craft may be a United States Air Force experimental craft. With this in mind, he moved closer. When he got roughly within 60 feet, Steve could hear two distinct voices, with one being higher pitched than the other. Believing that the voices came from Americans, Steve attempted to communicate with the occupants, offering mechanical support in English. According to Steve, the voices stopped as soon as he offered help. Not getting a reply from inside the craft, Steve also tried to communicate in Polish, then Russian, then German. Still, no replies came back. Steve crept closer to the open door of the craft and peered inside. He saw several flashing lights and beams emanating from several panels that lined the interior. Innocently and unthinkingly, he placed his hand on the craft with the intent of leaning in for a better look. The craft was incredibly hot, and he pulled his hand away, only to find that the fingertips of the gloves that he was wearing were melted. Suddenly, 3 panels slid across the open doorway, and the craft turned counterclockwise and tilted upwards. It was at that point that Steve was hit in the chest with an intense blast of heat, and he was thrown backwards, his clothing on fire. Upon hitting the ground, Steve tore the burning clothes from his body while the craft took off into the sky at a high rate of speed. Feeling disoriented and nauseous, he attempted to return to his room at the Falcon Motor Hotel. Vomiting several times while stumbling out of the provincial park, Steve was spotted by Constable G.A. Solotki of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Believing that Steve's stumbling was due to alcohol intoxication, the constable confronted Steve and noticed that there was no smell of alcohol at all. Constable Solotki offered to take Steve to get medical help a short distance away at Falcon Beach, but Steve declined the offer and was driven to the motel instead. According to archived RCMP documents, both the Army and Air Force were quick to respond to the area. Still feeling ill, Steve called his wife and explained the details of what happened. He told her he would be returning to Winnipeg, 144 kilometers or 89.5 miles away, via Greyhound bus. Upon returning home, he sought medical attention at the former Misericordia Emergency Hospital. Steve had burn marks on his chest that were clearly visible and made a grid-like pattern of raised sores. While in the hospital, he would suffer from severe headaches, blackouts, and rapid weight loss. His condition worsened to the point that he needed to seek help from the Mayo Clinic and its physicians. It was determined that he was sound of mind and that his condition was consistent with radiation poisoning. Although his lymphocyte count had fallen to near fatal levels, radiation tests showed levels of 0. Eventually, Steve's health would partially return. He would suffer from intermittent reappearances of the grid-like burns, but would go on to live a further 32 and a half years, passing away on October 28, 1999. After his encounter, he was reported to have shied away from interviews and was weary of the media, eventually breaking off contact with the outside world. Steve Michalak is reported to have died, still believing that the craft was an experimental one from the United States Air Force. This case is considered to be one of the most credible and well-documented cases in Canadian history, having been investigated by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canadian Department of Health, the Canadian Department of National Defence, and the Royal Canadian Air Force, as well as the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, known as APRO, and the United States Air Force as part of the Condon Committee, a study of unidentified flying object reports. The site of this incident was thoroughly investigated, and the unusual results found ranged from a 4.5 meter or 15-foot circle burned in the vegetation, high levels of radiation found in soil samples, as well as the remnants of the clothes that Steve had torn off, and highly radioactive metal that had been superheated and melted into the cracks of the surrounding rocks. The investigation by the United States Air Force ended in an inconclusive result. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the Canadian Armed Forces reports on the incident similarly yielded inconclusive results. The RCMP report emphasized their inability to explain Steve's physical effects, burns, and the burned circle of vegetation from the site. Did Steve Michalak encounter an American test craft of some kind? Was he inebriated by drugs or alcohol? Or did he encounter something extraterrestrial? What are your thoughts on the Falcon Lake incident? Let us know. And as always, stay curious.